In the heart of the Yakutian winter, where silence reigns and the cold kills, Aksinia, a deaf elder, felt the earth tremble. It wasn't the wind, but the heavy breathing and massive paws of 6 hungry Siberian tigers encircling her tent. She was trapped, and the village depended on her. The icy ground beneath the firs trembled like a frightened heart. It wasn't the familiar tremor of the living earth, but the heavy, uneven rhythm of hungry predators. Aksinia, her gloved fingers tightening around the hilt of her bone dagger, felt the presence of each of the 6 Siberian tigers. They were colossal masses of hunger and muscle, moving with a deliberate slowness that only intensified the terror. The air inside her reindeer hide tent was thin, each exhalation a dense cloud in the 70-degree sea cold, laden with the metallic tang of adrenaline and the wild, almost palpable scent of the felines outside. Silence for her was a vast and perilous landscape. But in this moment, even silence seemed charged. She didn't hear the growl, but felt the deep resonance of vibrations coursing through the ground, climbing her legs and spine, a menacing whisper that her skin and bones understood. One of the tigers, the largest and most audacious, dragged a heavy paw against the tent's outer wall. Aksinia felt the dry crack of compacted ice and the slight give of the hide under the immense weight. Her own body reacted with a visceral jolt, but she forced her muscles to remain still. The village depended on her held breath, on her heart beating like an ancestral drum. She closed her eyes, focusing not on the image of death outside, but on the memories of her granddaughter, of her people, of the hungry eyes she had promised to feed. It was their strength that held her together, an invisible armor against the icy panic. Her hand fumbled beside her, finding her bow and quiver of arrows. The polished bone tips felt cold and fragile against the flesh of her fingers. She knew one arrow was insufficient to bring down a creature of that size, especially 6. Her only hope lay in cunning, patience, and her ability to read the world through touch. The tigers, she realized, were not impatient. They were testing her, measuring the strength of their prey, awaiting the opportune moment. Hunger made them cautious, yet also relentless. She felt a slight shift in the weight of one, a circular movement around the tent. They were methodically encircling her, tightening the ring, searching for any weakness. Her breath froze in the air before it even left her lungs, a glacial dance between life and death. Aksinia slid, with the agility of one who knows every fold of her own body, to the center of the tent. There, the thin layer of ice was more stable, less prone to transmitting every vibration from the predators. She knelt, her dagger firmly in hand. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, swept over the hide walls. There was a small vent at the top, where smoke from an extinguished fire would normally escape. Through it, she could barely discern the darkness of the polar night, dotted by distant, cruel stars. Suddenly, the most intense vibration yet. An enormous padded paw struck the tent with a force that made the structure groan. The fabric stretched dangerously, almost giving way. The scent of the tigers intensified, a wild, damp odor that permeated the tent's fibers and Aksinia's soul. She felt the warm breath of one, so close that the air around the vent seemed to dance. Time stretched, each heartbeat a millennium. It was a test of will, a silent duel in the heart of the tundra. The night of terror had only just begun. The gigantic paw that struck the tent wasn't just a blow, it was a warning, a declaration of intent felt deeply by Aksinia. The hide fabric snapped, the bone structure groaning under immense pressure, and icy air rushed through the vent, carrying the warm, damp breath of the beast. The wild scent, dense and pungent, penetrated her nostrils, an odor of muscle, sweat, and predatory hunger that made her recoil viscerally, though her body remained motionless. Aksinia didn't react with panic, but with calculated agitation. Her fingers already tightened around the dagger's hilt, but the weapon seemed small and insignificant against the invisible force testing the limits of her shelter. She closed her eyes for an instant, feeling the vibrations of the ground. The tiger that had attacked the tent didn't retreat. Instead, it moved, raking its retractable claws against the hide, a rough, firm texture she could feel tearing the fibers. The growl for Axinia wasn't an audible sound, but a deep, continuous vibration that resonated through the ground, climbing her legs and reverberating in her chest. It was a profound murmur of anger and impatience that permeated her. Other, more subtle vibrations indicated that the other 5 tigers were also drawing closer, their circular movements now tighter, the siege closing in. With each step, she felt, the temperature inside her tent seemed to drop even further, not from the external cold, but from the icy dread emanating from the predators. She opened her eyes, her determined gaze sweeping the dark interior. The tent wouldn't hold much longer. Instinct urged her to flee, to try her luck in the vastness of the tundra, but ancestral wisdom held her back. Outside, she would be just another vulnerable speck in the white immensity, an easy target for the 6 hunters. Her only chance lay in her ability to anticipate, to transform her disadvantage into a weapon. The elder slid forward, fumbling along the ground until she found a small leather pouch. Inside, she kept a handful of dried herbs and a fragment of resinous wood. She had no way to light a fire, but the scent was strong. With a swift movement, she tore open the pouch, scattering the aromatic herbs at the base of one of the tent walls, where she felt the most intense presence of a tiger. It was a daring gamble, an attempt to confuse the predator's keen sense of smell, perhaps even to irritate it. The reaction was immediate. The vibration of the nearest tiger intensified, a sudden, sharp movement. The scent of the herbs, bittersweet and pungent, mingled with the animal odor, creating a disturbing olfactory symphony. There was a momentary retreat, a pause, as if the creature was assessing the new disturbance. But the truce was short-lived. Another tiger, the one on the opposite side of the tent, lunged with force. This time the blow was more decisive. A dry rip echoed in the gloom. The hide fabric gave way, and a dark, jagged slit opened in the tent wall, like a hungry eye watching her. Axinia felt the cutting gust of wind invade the space, bringing with it not just the cold, but the promise of imminent danger. She could feel the vibrations of the tiger's paws, the massive weight approaching the rip. The air around the opening seemed to vibrate, and she knew the animal's head was there, inches from her refuge. She didn't see the eyes, but felt the warmth of its heavy breath, the force of its interest. Axinia didn't hesitate. With her bone dagger firmly gripped, she threw herself to the side, rolling to the center of the tent, away from the rip. Her movements were precise, every muscle responding to the urgency of the situation. The cold tip of the bone against her palm was her only ally. She knew the night was young, and cunning would be her only chance. The tent, her last bastion, was compromised. The rip in the tent, now a gaping maw, seemed to pulse with the tiger's proximity. Axinia felt the warm, dense breath of the beast, so suffocatingly close that the air around it seemed to vibrate with the contained force of its will. She didn't see its eyes, but the presence was total, a mass of predatory intent that consumed all space. Her fingers already tightened around the hilt of her bone dagger, cold and familiar against her palm, a tactile reminder of her sole defense. There was no time to hesitate. With a movement that defied the stiffness imposed by age and extreme cold, Axinia lunged forward, not attacking the tiger directly, but aiming for the space between its unseen face and the torn edge of the hide. The sharp bone tip cut the icy air with a hiss that for her was an abrupt displacement of pressure, a clear act of interruption. The vibration emanating from the beast was immediate and violent, an abrupt recoil, a tremor that coursed through the ground and the tent structure with the force of a small seismic shock. The wild scent intensified for an instant, like a silent roar of surprise and fury, before receding slightly, though the threat still hung heavy. The tent groaned, the bone structure creaking and cracking under the impact of the tiger's recoil. The rip, though menacing, remained, and the brief truce was illusory. The vibrations of the other 5 tigers became more erratic, more impatient. Axinia felt their circular movements accelerate, the siege closing in with renewed urgency. One of them, on the opposite side, began testing the hide again, but this time with a series of quick, less powerful blows, as if mapping every weak point. Each impact was a distinct tremor that climbed her legs and resonated in her chest, a clear warning that time was running out. Axinia slid, with the agility of a shadow, to the back of the tent, where the ground was slightly raised, and the fabric seemed marginally thicker. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, swept the dark interior, searching for an advantage, a strategic path. The small smoke vent at the top now seemed less a route of escape and more a point of vulnerability, a silent invitation to the biting cold and the hungry eyes from above. She needed to act, not just react to the blows. The elder took a deep breath, the icy air burning her lungs, but the flame of her determination burned even brighter. The bone dagger was her only companion, an ancestral link to the strength of her people. The wisdom of her ancestors whispered in her mind, not in words, but in instincts, in a profound understanding of the wild and its predators. She knew the tigers were not just muscle. They were primal intelligence, icy patience, and an iron will. They were mirrors of the tundra itself. With her decision made, Axinia turned to the newly opened rip, not to repair it, but to enlarge it. With the sharp blade, she began cutting the hide fabric with quick, precise movements, tearing it into a larger, more deliberate opening. Each cut was an act of defiance, each yielding fiber a step toward the unknown, but also toward control of the situation. The fabric snapped and tore forcefully, widening the dark more to the outside. The wind howled, an icy melody that invaded the space, and the scent of the tigers became overwhelming, mingling with the metallic odor of freshly cut hide. The vibrations of the tiger that had recoiled intensified again. It was approaching the new enlarged rip, drawn by the movement and the scent. Axinia knew she was exposing herself, but it was a calculated risk. She needed space, a battlefield where she could use her cunning and her understanding of vibrations. The tent was no longer a safe refuge, but a trap she needed to turn against her captors. The 70°C cold, penetrating the opening, was a cruel reminder of what awaited her outside. But the claustrophobia of the surrounded tent was an even greater terror. With a final effort, she tore enough to create an exit. What would come next, she didn't know, but it would be on her own terms, a duel between reason and instinct, where the village's survival hung by a thread. The wind's howl cut the air, an icy blade that penetrated Axinia to the bone, emanating from the opening she had just created. The rip, now wide enough for a body to pass through, seemed to swallow the tent's residual warmth, transforming it from a precarious shelter into a passage to the white hell. The wild scent of the tigers, previously filtered by the fabric, now exploded into her nostrils. A direct and overwhelming assault that spoke of taut muscles, warm breath, and the primal hunger that drove them. She felt the vibration of the nearest tiger intensify, a deep growl that didn't resonate in her ears, but in her chest, a sound felt in the earth beneath her feet. Axinia didn't hesitate. There was no time for fear to paralyze. With her bone dagger firmly gripped, she didn't lunge out, but slid to the edge of the rip, peering, not with her eyes, but with her skin and muscles. The air in front of the opening pulsed with the beast's presence. She felt the texture of the ice beneath the skin of her hands, the fresh snow that crackled with slight pressure. The darkness outside was almost absolute, broken only by the distant shimmer of the aurora borealis, a ghostly promise that seemed to mock her plight. The vibrations of the tiger before her were clear, a dense, impatient mass. She used this. With a swift, calculated movement, she flung the empty pouch of dried herbs out of the tent, aiming for a spot slightly to the tiger's left, where she felt a small depression in the snow. The light pouch made a faint sound as it landed, a subtle displacement of particles. The reaction was immediate and violent. The tiger roared, a sound that for Axinia was a deep tremor that shook the tent itself, making the bone structure groan in protest. The beast attacked the pouch with blind fury, its sharp claws tearing the harmless leather. The distraction, however brief, was enough. The instant the tiger lunged at the inanimate object, Axinia launched herself through the opening. She rolled out, her flexible body moving with surprising agility for her age. The fall into the soft snow cushioned the impact, but the cold penetrated her clothes in an instant. She felt the ice flakes on her face, an electric shock that sharpened her senses further. Her eyes, accustomed to the tent's gloom, tried to adjust to the vast darkness of the tundra. But it was in the vibrations that she trusted. The tiger that had attacked the pouch was momentarily disoriented, its fury wasted on an illusion. But the other five, the other five. They had perceived her movement. The ground vibrations became a maelstrom. She felt the movements of each. One approached the tent, circling it, as if searching for her exit point. Another, more distant, seemed to prepare for a pounce, its body tense, paws sinking into the snow for a sudden thrust. Two others moved to flank, attempting to circumvent her position. The sixth remained in a more strategic position, about 15 meters away, the vibration of its body emanating a predatory patience that was almost more terrifying than the other's fury. Axinia knelt in the snow, her body hunched, the bone dagger pointing forward, not as a weapon of attack, but as an extension of her senses. She needed an advantage, something more than her dagger. Her eyes swept the night landscape, the tundra stretching into a white, cruel immensity. Where could she position herself? The terrain was monotonous, without large rocks or trees for shelter, only snow and ice, sculpted by the wind into soft, treacherous dunes. But then she felt something, a subtle vibration, different from those of the tigers. Beneath the soft layer of snow, there was an irregularity in the terrain, a rocky elevation, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, but detectable to her sensitive feet. It was small, but it could offer a minimal advantage, a slightly higher point from which she might better anticipate the predator's movements. With a swift decision, Axinia began to move, not running, not in panic, but with a determined, calculated stride, sinking into the deep snow with each movement. Her muscles screamed with the cold and effort, but her mind was focused, every fiber of her being attuned to the environment. The tigers moved with her, a deadly, silent ballet in the darkness. One approached dangerously from behind, a quick, powerful tremor rising through the snow. Axinia knew that at any moment the assault would come, and the fight for life would be visceral and relentless. Axinia moved with the urgency of prey, but with the precision of a hunter. The deep snow clung to her boots, each step a Herculean effort that drained what little energy she had left. The cold was a constant enemy, biting exposed skin and seeping into the layers of her garments. But the terror of being hunted was a strange warmth that propelled her, an adrenaline that ignited her aged muscles. The vibrations of the tiger behind her grew more intense, faster. It wasn't a flanking movement, but a direct charge, a mass of muscle and hunger hurled against her. She felt the snow being displaced, a wave of pressure reaching her even before the beast's body was close. There was no time to turn fully. Axinia twisted her torso, her body heavy with effort and age. But the bone dagger flew as an extension of her will. She didn't aim for the tiger's eyes, but for the pulsating mass she felt approaching, the exact point where throat and shoulder met. The blade didn't penetrate deeply, but scraped the thick hide with considerable force. The impact was like hitting living rock, a vibration of fury and pain, a tremor that spread through the air, indicated the animal's abrupt recoil. The tiger stumbled, its balance broken for an instant, surprised to have its attack so directly thwarted. A low, hoarse growl escaped the beast's throat, a guttural vibration Axinia felt in her bones. The brief repulsion gave her the seconds she needed. With one last desperate surge, Axinia reached the rocky elevation. It was small, barely waist-high, but it was solid, a bastion of stone in a sea of soft snow. She clambered onto it, not to stand, but to position herself, gaining a minimal height that allowed her to feel the tiger's vibrations in a slightly different, less diffuse way. The wind howled even stronger on that small ridge, whipping snowflakes into her face, but the elder didn't care. Her feet now felt the cold, unyielding rock beneath her boots, a direct contact with the earth, a conduit for the information surrounding her. The tigers, in turn, reacted to her new position. The one that had been repelled didn't immediately attack again, but rejoined the others, who had already completed their encirclement. The vibrations now weren't random, but coordinated. Axinia felt 3 of them move forward, closing the distance, while the other 3, further back, seemed to await the opportune moment, ready to flank if she tried to escape. The most distant tiger, the one radiating predatory patience, maintained its strategic position, a silent sentinel observing the unfolding scene. The entire tundra seemed to vibrate with anticipation, a tense stillness that preceded the inevitable. Axinia tightened her grip on the bone dagger, her palm numb against the icy hilt. She was the prey, yes, but also the guardian of her people. Ancestral wisdom, an underground river of knowledge, flowed through her veins. She didn't see the hungry eyes, but felt the icy glint of their intent, the scent of their strength, the weight of their hunger. The rock beneath her feet was more than a refuge. It was an altar, an observation post, the stage for the final act of her hunt. She took a deep breath, drawing in the icy air that burned her lungs, but also ignited a new determination in her chest. The tigers would come, she knew, and they would come with the fury of hunger and the intelligence of predators not to be underestimated. But Axinia was not alone. The whispers of ancestors, the vibrations of her waiting people, all enveloped her like an invisible cloak of strength. She was not fighting just for her life, but for the lives of all. And that truth, more than any dagger, was her sharpest weapon. The vibrations of the 3 front tigers accelerated, a crescendo of intent that climbed the rock and resonated in her body. The attack would come, not 1, but 3. And in an instant, the stillness of the tundra would be torn by the brutality of survival. Axinia leaned forward, her dagger extended, ready to face the imminent storm. The 3 beasts launched themselves. Axinia felt the rock beneath her feet sing with the tiger's weight and speed. It wasn't a straight-line attack, but a wave of predatory intent that divided and converged, seeking to engulf her small bastion. The air around her grew dense with the animal's presence, the scent of damp, wild fur invading her frozen nostrils. The tiger on the left arrived first, a massive shadow rising over the stone. Axinia didn't see the open maw, but felt the tremor of its jaw in her teeth, a primal desire for annihilation. She raised her dagger, not in a wild swing, but in a calculated thrust. The icy bone met resistance, a tense muscle in the animal's foreleg. A sharp yelp felt more as a painful contraction in the air, echoed in the tundra's silence. And the tiger recoiled with an awkward leap, its wounded paw stumbling. The elder had no time to register the success. At the same instant, the central tiger lunged. Its silhouette, magnified by the darkness and proximity, was a specter of brute force. Axinia spun, using the animal's momentum against itself. Instead of blocking, she dodged slightly, allowing the beast to pass by her. dangerously brushing her shoulder. She felt the warmth of the tiger's body, the vibration of its coarse fur against her garment. The bone dagger, propelled by her spinning motion, traced a swift arc. The cut wasn't deep, just a long scratch on its flank. But the surprise and discomfort made the predator let out a snarl of fury and retreat, unbalanced, sinking into the snow. The third tiger, on the right, attempted a direct pounce, aiming for Aksinia's head, but the rock's elevation unbalanced its leap. She felt the vibration of its claws impacting the stone, a dry, powerful sound that resonated throughout her body. The elder flinched, the impact forcing her to sink down but not knocking her off. The tiger without purchase slipped and fell awkwardly into the deep snow below, howling with a mixture of rage and frustration. For a few seconds, the encirclement seemed to break. The three tigers that had attacked were now wounded, albeit lightly, and disoriented. Their vibrations were of confusion and irritation, no longer of a coordinated assault. The air that had pulsed with the ferocity of their charge now seemed calmer, though still charged with an electric tension. Aksinia seized the brief interlude. Her own muscles burned, the effort draining her last reserves. The cold was a constant sting, and icy sweat trickled down her back. But the sense of danger was still vivid, an undercurrent that coursed through the rock. The other three tigers, those that had been waiting, hadn't moved. Their presences were like silent, icy mountains, observing, learning from their siblings' mistakes. She felt the most distant tiger, the strategist, reposition itself. The vibration of its body was stronger now, more focused. It had advanced a few meters, closing the distance, and the elder felt its intent harden. The two flanking tigers were also adjusting their positions, moving further to the sides, seeking an attack angle that would circumvent the rock. The elder knew the advantage was illusory. 3 blows hadn't been fatal, merely repelled. The tigers weren't fools. They would learn. The rock offered protection, but also immobilized her, making her a fixed target. She couldn't run, not without being brought down by the flankers, and the tigers' injuries were superficial, not enough to dissuade them from the hunger that drove them. A low, deep growl emanated from the nearest tiger, a vibration that spread through the ground, a sound felt in every cell of her body. It was a challenge, a warning. The encirclement was closing in again. But this time, with a more refined strategy, they were communicating, coordinating their movements through growls and glances in the darkness, which Aksinia felt as pulses of intent in the icy air. The hope of her people, the weight of her responsibility, was a heavy burden, but also an inexhaustible source of strength. Aksinia was not just an elder, she was an extension of the tundra itself, shaped by the harshness of the environment, attuned to its secrets. She felt the tiger's hunger, but they also felt her determination. The battle was not just for flesh, but for dominance, for survival. The tundra pulsed, not just with wind and cold, but with life and death, with the will to survive. Aksinia, her bone dagger still firm in her hand, raised her head. Her eyes, though they couldn't clearly see the predators in the darkness, felt the pressure of their presences. The scent of ice and wild fur grew more intense. The next attack would be different, more calculating, and she would have to be even more prepared. The night was long, and the fight was just beginning. Still on the small rocky elevation, Aksinia felt the shift. The tundra beneath her feet no longer pulsed with the impetuous fury of an uncoordinated charge, but with the tense, deliberate stillness of a renewed strategy. The tiger she identified as the strategist, the one whose vibration was cold and focused, had advanced further, its body now a massive and imposing presence, not far from the base of her stone. The two flankers had also completed their movement, establishing a wider yet equally deadly semicircle behind the central predator. The icy air around Axinia grew even denser, saturated with feline presence. It wasn't just the scent of snow and damp fur, but the metallic odor of intent, the bitterness of predatory patience. She felt the low, deep growls the tigers exchanged, not as audible sounds, but as pressure waves vibrating through the rock, communicating plans, marking positions. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, tried to discern the silhouettes moving between shadows and snowdrifts, but it was her ability to feel that truly revealed the threat. The strategist didn't attack directly. Instead, Axinia felt a wave of pressure move from the left flank. One of the tigers, the one that had repositioned itself, was approaching, not in a frontal pounce, but crawling low, using the higher snow as cover, seeking a blind spot. The elder leaned, extending her bone dagger, focusing on the subtle vibrations rising from the compacted snow. She felt the elevation of the terrain, a slight incline the tiger was using to gain height without visually alerting her. When the tiger emerged from the snow, a dark, agile shadow, Axinia was ready. The attack came from an unexpected angle, an extended forepaw reaching to grab her leg. She didn't have time for a precise strike, but used the dagger to deflect. The bones scraped the animal's sharp claws, a harsh, dry sound that resonated in her hand, and she felt the force of the impact on the rock beneath her feet. The tiger hissed, a furious vibration that made her teeth chatter, and recoiled, frustrated, unable to gain purchase. But this distraction was part of the plan. The moment the first tiger retreated, the strategist, who had remained motionless, made its move. Not an attack, but a maneuver of intimidation. It let out a low, guttural roar, a vibration so powerful that Axinia felt her internal organs tremble, a sound that seemed to tear the very air. The noise was overwhelming, projecting a wave of terror aimed at paralyzing her, disorienting her. For a brief instant, the elder faltered. The intensity of the vibration was overwhelming, a primal cacophony that shook her concentration. It was the first time she had felt such power, a silent scream that seemed to drain her very strength. But like an oak rooted in rock, Axinia held firm. She clung to her wisdom, to the image of her hungry people, to the weight of the hope she carried. As the wave of sound subsided, the second flanker launched itself, seizing the moment of vulnerability. It attempted an audacious leap, aiming for her upper body, hoping to knock her off the rock. Axinia, still reeling slightly from the roar, reacted by instinct. She ducked swiftly, her dagger raised in a defensive movement. The tiger's massive body swept past her, its coarse fur brushing her hood. The blade found only empty air before the animal landed awkwardly behind the stone, its claws scraping the granite with a grating sound. The predator let out a snarl of rage and turned to attempt a new attack, but Axinia was already recovering. She felt the rock tremble with the tiger's weight as it tried to regain its balance. Adrenaline pulsed in her veins, a fire burning away the fatigue. The superficial injuries on the previous tigers, the evident frustration in their vibrations, and now this new, more calculated yet still failed attempt at assault. All confirmed that she, despite being aged and deaf, was a formidable adversary. The strategist moved again, its vibration indicating a more direct approach now that the other two flankers had failed in their immediate purpose. The three original tigers, those with minor injuries, also began to move, their presences blending into the darkness, creating a ring of intent around the rock. They wouldn't make the same mistake again. They would attack her in concert, from multiple points, exploiting her fixed location. Axinia knew her resistance was finite. The cold bit at her extremities, and each movement demanded monumental effort. But the flame of determination burned in her chest, warming her against the cold and fear. She was not just an elder on a rock, she was the wall between the life and death of her people. And as long as there was breath in her body, she would resist. The entire tundra waited, silent, for the next move, the next confrontation that would decide the fate of a life and of a village. The air grew dense with an icy premonition. Axinia felt the vibrations intensify around the rock, no longer as individual charges, but as a single, massive wave of predatory intent rising from the frozen ground. 4 tigers launched themselves almost simultaneously. 2 of them, the flankers who had failed in their previous attempts, now scaled the rock from opposite sides, their paws scraping the granite with a dry, powerful sound that resonated throughout the elder's body. The strategist, with a surprisingly agile movement for its colossal mass, advanced from the front, while a 4th tiger, one of the injured, leapt from behind, seeking to corner her. Axinia spun, her bone dagger a blur in the gloom. She felt the left flanker's paw reach her shoulder, its sharp claws tearing through the thick garment. A searing pain exploded through her body, a thermal shock that made her gasp. But she didn't falter. Instead of defending directly, she used the animal's momentum. With a swift movement, she shoved the tiger aside, turning its attack into a loss of balance. The predator slipped on the snow, yelping with fury and frustration, and fell heavily. Before she could recover, the strategist was upon her. There was no pounce, but a brutal charge of its massive body, aiming to knock her off the rock. Axinia felt the violent impact of the tiger's chest against hers, a blow that crushed her against the stone. The air was expelled from her lungs in an inaudible groan, and the world spun. The bone dagger fell from her numb hand, disappearing into the deep snow below, swallowed by the white shroud. She felt the oppressive warmth of the tiger's body, the wild scent of its fur, the overwhelming force of its muscles. For an instant, Axinia thought it was the end. But, deep within her being, an ancient, resilient fury ignited. With a silent cry of determination, she dug her fingers into the tiger's back, seeking purchase, anything to avoid being dragged onto the icy ground. The tiger that had leaped from behind, seeing its opportunity, tried to bite her exposed leg, but Axinia, even stunned, felt the vibration of the attack and twisted her body with surprising force. The tiger's strike hit empty air, and the elder, seizing the momentum, rolled over the rock, sliding to the opposite side, falling heavily into the snow. The impact was brutal. Her aged body groaned in protest, and a searing pain shot through her leg as it hit a hidden ice protrusion. She felt the rock vibrate above her, the strategist roaring in anger at having lost its prey. The other 2 tigers still on the rock, and the 2 waiting in the snow, now converged. The encirclement, broken for a few seconds, was now tighter than ever. Axinia was on the ground, her dagger lost, her body aching, the cold penetrating every cell of her being. The snow seemed to swallow her strength, and despair threatened to infiltrate her heart. But the thought of her village, of the hungry faces awaiting her return, was a balm to her wounded soul. She could not yield. With a Herculean effort she tried to stand. Her fingers tingled with cold, and the pain in her leg made her stumble. She felt the vibrations of the tigers approaching from all sides, their presences like walls of ice and fury. The rock was no longer a refuge. She was exposed, vulnerable, in the heart of the tundra, with 6 hungry and irritated predators closing in for the final kill. Still, her eyes swept the darkness, searching for any advantage, any hope. The tundra, indifferent and cruel, offered nothing but snow and ice. But Axinia was not a woman to give up. She was Axinia, the last hope of her people. And the last hope never dies without fighting to the last breath. The ground beneath her feet vibrated again, a deep unison growl of triumph and anticipation. The moment of truth had arrived. The icy ground seemed to pulse beneath Axinia, not just with the furious anticipation of the tigers, but with a new, unsettling cadence. The searing pain in her leg, the cold that numbed her fingers, the emptiness where her dagger should be, all of it was real. A song of despair resonating through her aged body. She felt the 6 feline presences tighten their encirclement, each a mountain of fury and hunger, their vibrations converging like invisible bonds, pinning her to the ground. The strategist, imposing and patient, remained at the forefront, a concentrated mass of intent. The others positioned themselves, their dark silhouettes dancing at the edges of her peripheral vision. Despair threatened to choke her, but then, from a place deeper than ice and stone, a subtle vibration, almost inaudible to anyone else, rose through the earth. It wasn't the tiger's growl, nor the howling wind, but a deep, constant tremor, an underground stir that she recognized with an icy chill. The ice around her, the very ice that had hidden the protrusion that wounded her leg, seemed unstable, fragile. Ancestral knowledge awoke within her, a reminder of treacherous lands where thin ice could conceal abysses of frigid water. The tigers didn't sense it. Their attention was fixed on her, their predatory minds focused on the immobilized prey. The strategist let out a growl, a vibration that was a command to its companions, and one of the flanking tigers lunged. It was a swift, brutal movement, a swipe aimed at her face. Axinia, with an agility that surprised even herself, rolled aside, the paw's impact scraping the snow where her head had been seconds before. She felt the animal's warm breath as it passed, the scent of prey and savagery. But her movement brought her closer to the point where the underground vibration was most intense. The snow beneath her seemed to give way a little more. A harsh sound of groaning ice rose through her arms, a warning. The danger was twofold now, the hungry tigers and the ground that threatened to swallow her. With the loss of her dagger, her hands frantically searched for anything. Her fingers found a sharp piece of ice, broken off from some fissure, keen as a blade. It wasn't her bone dagger, but it was something. She clutched it, the cold cutting into her palm, and a new determination, cold and sharp as the ice itself, ignited in her gaze. The strategist, impatient with Axinia's prolonged resistance, made its final move. Its vibration, previously contained, now radiated an intent to kill. It prepared for a pounce, a decisive blow that would crush her. The other tigers, sensing their leader's intention, retreated slightly, awaiting the moment to feed. Axinia felt the ground beneath the strategist tiger, and beneath herself, vibrate with even greater intensity. The ice groaned, a deep lament that seemed to come from the earth's entrails. It was an insane risk, a leap into the void, but it was the only chance she had left. Her eyes swept the darkness, searching for any sign, any fissure. She perceived the incline of the terrain beneath the ice, a subtle depression the strategist was ignoring in its haste. The strategist tiger launched itself. Not a roar, but a wave of pressure that shook the air, the promise of an inevitable end. Its massive body surged forward, snow spraying around its powerful paws. Axinia, instead of retreating, threw her body forward, toward the point of greatest instability. With surprising strength, she plunged the piece of ice into the exact spot where the underground vibration was strongest, directly in the tiger's path. The ice beneath her feet cracked with a loud, dry snap, a sound that reverberated through the silent tundra like a gunshot. The strategist, caught by surprise by the sudden collapse of the ground beneath it, let out a roar of fury and disorientation. Its front paws sank, and its massive body lost balance, dragging the ice in its fall. Axinia felt the icy abyss opening, a new and terrible threat. She was trapped on the edge of the fissure, the broken ice threatening to pull her down with it. The world spun again, and she clung to a piece of solid ice, the sharp shard still in her hand. As the strategist tiger fell, its roar of rage and terror echoing in the icy pit. The other tigers stopped, their vibrations of triumph transformed into confusion and dread. The collapse of the ice, the roar of their falling leader, the sudden opening of the earth, all of it was incomprehensible to them. They recoiled, hesitant, while Axinia, clinging to the edge of the newly formed abyss, felt excruciating pain in her hands and legs. The icy wind rose from the fissure, bringing with it the scent of frozen water and the absence of the alpha predator. She had gained a brief moment, but the precipice beneath her was as deadly as the predators observing her. Her body trembled, exhaustion and pain crushing her, but the sight of the strategist's fall, proof that the tundra could be as treacherous as its inhabitants, rekindled her flame. Axinia was not safe, but the scales had tipped, and the remaining tigers, leaderless, now hesitated. The night was long, and the tundra had just revealed another of its deadly secrets. Axinia clung to the jagged ice, the cold cutting her palms like 1,000 needles. The sharp piece of ice was still in her hand, now more an anchor than a weapon. The wind whipped, kicking up snow and carrying with it the metallic scent of danger and the echo of the strategist's roar, already muffled by the depths of the fissure. She felt the vibration of the earth beneath her fingers, a tremor different from before, less a lament and more a whisper of precarious stability. The 5 remaining tigers, now without firm leadership, displayed palpable confusion. Their vibrations were erratic, a mixture of fear and hunger. They circled the edge of the newly formed abyss, their paws hesitating in the snow. One of them, the flanker that had torn her shoulder, let out a sharp snarl, a vibration of frustration that was not a command, but a lament. Axinia knew the hesitation wouldn't last. Hunger was a cruel master, and soon instinct would override confusion. With an agonizing effort, she pulled her body up. Every muscle screamed in protest, her wounded leg pulsed with searing pain. The friction of the ice tore at her skin, but she could not yield. Her fingers tingled, burning and freezing at the same time. Finally, with a last push, she managed to roll away from the edge, falling face down into the snow. The impact reverberated through her body, but she was once again on solid ground, or as solid as the tundra could be. She had no time to catch her breath. The tiger's vibrations shifted, becoming more cohesive, more menacing. They had perceived her renewed vulnerability. The fury of the hunt, briefly obscured, was back. One of the tigers, perhaps the boldest or the hungriest, advanced first. It wasn't the strategist's calculated attack, but a wild lunge, driven by desperation. Axinia, still on the ground, tried to move. The pain in her leg was excruciating, but the need for survival was stronger. She dragged herself, using her arms to propel herself, the piece of ice still firmly clutched in her hand. She felt the air vibrate with the tiger's movement, the sound of snow being thrown. She spun, raising the piece of ice in a desperate attempt at defense. The tiger, with its feline agility, managed to deflect the crude blow, but the unexpected movement made it hesitate. Its eyes gleaming in the gloom, fixed on her, a mixture of rage and caution. The other tigers, emboldened by their companion's audacity, began to move again, closing the circle. The elder realized the advantage of the terrain had vanished. She was once again on the open tundra, a tiny speck against the white vastness. The wind howled, mocking her plight. With each breath, the icy air burned her lungs. She felt the vibrations of paws drawing closer, the relentless rhythm of the hunt. The piece of ice in her hand seemed useless against the combined force of 5 predators. But then, a subtle tremor, different from anything she had felt before, rose through the earth. It wasn't the groaning ice, nor the moving tigers. It was deeper, more pulsating, a profound hum that seemed to come from dozens of meters below. Axinia paused, her senses searching for the origin of that new vibration. It was an ancestral melody, a sound her people knew, but one that rarely manifested. It was the sound of the great subterranean river, the one that flowed beneath the tundra's depths, now unleashing its imprisoned force. The earth began to tremble more visibly, a vibration the tigers also felt. Their growls turned into yelps of uncertainty, their paws halting. The ice around her began to crack with dry snaps, not just in the fissure that had swallowed the strategist, but in new directions, opening like a giant spiderweb. It was a sign of something imminent, something that nature, in its fury, was about to unleash. The chaos that followed was not her doing, but that of the tundra's own pulsating heart, and in that chaos, Axinia saw a new and perhaps final chance. The ground shuddered beneath Axinia, a tremor different from any she had felt before, deeper than the localized collapse that had swallowed the strategist. It was as if a giant heart, buried in the earth's entrails, had begun to beat with a desperate, accelerated rhythm. The ice, already a patchwork of fissures, groaned under the tension, its lament rising through her bones. She could feel the intricate network of cracks spreading, a spiderweb of destruction expanding from the epicenter of the subterranean river's awakening. The 5 remaining tigers, their hunting instincts at war with a primal fear of the unknown, recoiled. Their powerful bodies tensed, ears flattened, eyes wide with confusion. Their growls, once menacing, became yelps of dread, sharp vibrations that resonated with the ground's instability. One of them, the flanker that had wounded her, scraped the ice with its claws, seeking purchase that wasn't there. Hunger still drove them, but the earth itself had become an unpredictable enemy. Axinia, however, felt the melody of chaos differently. For her, the tremor wasn't just a threat, it was information. Each crack of the ice, each vibration of the subterranean rock drew a map of danger and opportunity in her mind. The deep hum of the river, now a continuous roar, indicated the direction of the greatest disturbance, the heart of the instability. Her wounded leg pulsed, a constant reminder of her physical vulnerability, but the clarity of her mind was sharp as the ice in her hand. She realized that the web of cracks was deepening, some opening into narrow fissures, others into wider abysses, like the one that had swallowed their leader. The icy air rising from these new openings carried the pungent scent of minerals and subterranean water. Fine snow began to collapse into some fissures, revealing the damp darkness below. The tundra was tearing itself apart. With renewed purpose, Axinia began to move, not a desperate flight, but a calculated movement, guided by the vibrations. She dragged herself, ignoring the pain, toward an area where the ice seemed thinnest, where the cracks were more frequent and sharp. She felt that there, beneath the surface, the subterranean river beat more violently against the ice crust. The tigers, perceiving her movement, interpreted it as weakness, a prey's last gasp. The boldest, the same one that had attempted the initial pounce, launched itself again, its massive body tearing through the icy air. Its vibration was an arrow of intent, direct and deadly. Axinia waited, her senses fixed on the point where the tiger would land, a spot she knew was directly over one of the deepest cracks. At the last instant, she rolled aside, the piece of ice in her hand scoring the snow. The tiger, driven by fury, couldn't stop in time. Its front paws hit the ice with force, but found no expected resistance. A deafening crack filled the air, louder and more piercing than any other. The ice beneath the tiger gave way instantly, not in a clean fissure, but in an explosion of fragments. The animal let out a roar of panic and despair, a vibration that was pure agony as its massive body was swallowed by the opening earth. One more. The 3 remaining tigers froze, their vibrations of confusion now tinged with pure terror. They scrambled away from the edge of the new abyss, their paws slipping on the snow, desperate to find stable ground. Hunger, for a moment, was supplanted by the fear of the earth itself. Axinia, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, gulped in the icy air. She was once again at the edge of a precipice, but this time the fall wasn't hers. The piece of ice was still in her hand, an extension of her will. She had understood the tundra's dance, and now she was using it as a weapon. She rose, stumbling, but with a new strength in her gaze. Her eyes scanned the three remaining tigers, who now huddled together, their growls low and hesitant. The chaos continued, the ground trembled, and new cracks echoed in the night. But Axinia was no longer just surviving. She was fighting, and the tundra, with its pulsating, treacherous heart, was fighting alongside her. The night was still long, but the number of predators dwindled, and the elder had found her advantage in the uncontrollable fury of nature. The three remaining tigers, a vestige of the power that had once cornered her, retreated further, their growls low and hesitant. The newly opened abyss, a steaming wound in the tundra, exhaled the same metallic scent as the other fissure, a primal warning that the earth was as deadly as any predator. Axinia, standing, felt the pulsation of the ice beneath her boots, a chaotic rhythm that intensified. The piece of ice in her hand seemed to vibrate in unison with the earth, an extension of her will, no longer just a weapon, but a conduit for nature's fury. The tiger's eyes, which once burned with the ferocity of the hunt, now displayed a flicker of distrust and terror. Hunger still drove them, an unquenchable flame in their empty bellies, but the fear of misstepping, of being swallowed by the earth itself, was a cruel master. They were not easy prey nor naive, but the tundra was rewriting the rules of the hunt. Axinia knew that hesitation was a temporary luxury. Starvation was a force as potent as the instinct for survival. She needed to act before coherence returned to her attackers. Her wounds throbbed, a constant chorus of pain. Her torn shoulder, her pulsing leg, each breath scratching her lungs. But in her mind, an icy clarity had settled. She was no longer fleeing, she was guiding the chaos. She felt the tremor shift, a new wave of faster, more superficial vibrations. The ice before her, where the tigers were huddled, seemed to be under greater tension. Small cracks, almost invisible to the naked eye, began to form, thin lines spreading like frozen tree branches. The roar of the subterranean river, once a distant lament, had now transformed into an incessant bellow that seemed to come from just beneath the surface, a continuous thunder. Axinia moved with intent, not to flee, but to position herself. She walked, or rather dragged herself, to the side, to a point where the vibrations were most intense, where the ice seemed most unstable. Her senses, though she couldn't hear the sound, perceived the intensity of the fissures, the way the fine snow trembled over the new openings. One of the tigers, the youngest and perhaps the most desperate, let out a low, menacing growl. It didn't advance, but its eyes followed Axinia, seeking the moment of weakness. The other two kept further back, their bodies tense, their paws testing the ground cautiously. The dynamic had shifted. They were hunting, yes, but they were also being hunted by the environment. Axinia raised the piece of ice, not as a challenge, but as an indicator. She tapped it lightly on the surface, not at a random spot, but at a location where the vibrations indicated greater solidity, yet adjacent to an area of critical fragility. The sound of the impact was muffled by the wind's fury, but the gesture was clear. She was marking the ground. The tremor beneath the earth intensified, and the ice where the tigers stood began to creak and crack alarmingly. One of the tigers, unable to contain its dread, tried to leap away, but its paws slipped on the yielding snow beneath it. It roared, a sound of animal despair, as it tried to regain its balance. It was the moment. Axinia, with surprising speed for her wounded body, launched herself, not at the tiger, but toward a newly formed crack opening between the group. The piece of ice in her hand wasn't to wound, but to widen. She plunged it with all her might into the fissure, using the sharp point to force the opening. The ice responded. With a tearing sound, the crack deepened and widened, expanding beneath the tiger's feet. The animal that was already slipping lost its footing completely. Its cries of panic mingled with the sound of disintegrating ice. It fell, not into a deep abyss, but into a narrow, jagged trench where the ice closed over it, trapping it. Its roars became muffled, a lament lost in the tundra's roar. Two, only two remained. Axinia recoiled, her body arching with exhaustion, her hands bleeding and burning from the effort. But there was a spark of triumph in her eyes. The tundra was her deadliest ally. The two remaining tigers, now in full panic, no longer concerned themselves with the hunt. Pure survival instinct took over. They turned and ran, their powerful paws scrambling for purchase on the unstable ice. Their bodies were dark blurs that vanished into the gloom, leaving behind only the vibrations of their terror, which rapidly diminished in the distance. Silence. A deafening silence, broken only by the wind's howl and the incessant bellow of the subterranean river. The tundra continued to tremble, but the immediate danger had passed. Axinia was alone again, standing amidst a field of cracked ice, her body aching, her spirit resilient. She looked at the piece of ice in her hand, now stained a dark red. There were no more visible enemies. The night was still long, and the hunt for her village had not yet ended. But now the scales had tipped decisively. She had survived the night of terror, but surviving was not enough. She needed to hunt. And the tundra, which had been her weapon and her defense, now awaited her next move. The wind's howl and the subterranean river's bellow filled the vacuum left by the tiger's panic. Axinia was alone again, but the stillness that followed the predator's flight was heavy, more a burden than a relief. The piece of ice in her hand, once an extension of her furious will, now felt merely like a cold weight, stained dark red. The adrenaline that had propelled her until then began to drain, revealing the profound exhaustion that had settled upon her battered body. With each beat of her heart, a sharp pang reverberated in her torn shoulder, a constant reminder of the ferocity she had faced. Her wounded leg throbbed with a rhythm of its own, insistent, and every muscle in her body protested. She felt the 70-degree cold penetrate even deeper into her bones, now that the heat of battle had subsided. Oxygen was a luxury her lungs burned to extract from the thin air. Axinia looked at the trail left by the fleeing tigers, their pawprints disappearing into the gently falling snow. They were gone, but the hunt was not. Her purpose wasn't merely to survive the night, but to bring life to the village on the brink of starvation. The scales had tipped, yes, but only in the balance of personal survival. The balance of her people's hope still hung precariously. The tundra continued to tremble, no longer with the chaotic fury of a battlefield, but with the persistent pulsation of a slumbering giant. Each vibration was a murmur, a constant conversation from the earth beneath her feet. She closed her eyes, allowing the sensations to become her primary guide. The growl of the subterranean river still dominated, a deep, continuous sound that resonated in her chest. But now she could discern nuances, more subtle patterns in the surface vibrations. Some of these vibrations were short and quick, like the beating of a bird's wings, but much stronger. Others were slow and drawn out, indicating the distant shifting of ice. But there was a distinct pattern, an intermittent rhythm of muffled impacts, coming from a direction that the tiger's chaos had prevented her from noticing before. It was a vibration that seemed to come from a less unstable area of the ice, a point where the crust was thicker. It was the rhythm of something alive, something large. Still stumbling, Axinia began to move again, this time with a new kind of determination. It wasn't the desperate flight of prey, nor the calculated fury of a warrior. It was the patience and cunning of a hunter. She abandoned the stained piece of ice, its utility as a weapon exhausted, and let her sensitive fingers glide over the ice surface, seeking the slightest resonances. With each step, the pain in her leg was afire, and her shoulder protested, but the image of her village, of the hungry faces of the children, was a balm more potent than any salve. She dragged herself toward the source of the vibrations, to an area where snow accumulated in soft dunes, where the wind sculpted ghostly shapes. The cold bit relentless, and the darkness of the night seemed to swallow any remnant of hope. But Axinia felt it. She felt life beneath the ice, a promise of food, perhaps the last. The muffled sound, the rhythmic tremor grew clearer, stronger. It wasn't the growl of a predator, nor the lament of the earth tearing itself apart. It was the movement of a large creature, perhaps a woolly mammoth, seeking sustenance beneath the ice, its massive paws thudding against the frozen crust. She knew that hunting a mammoth was a task for dozens of men, not for a wounded elder. But the tundra had proven an unexpected ally. If the vibrations indicated the animal was over an area of thinner ice or near a hidden fissure, her wisdom could be more powerful than any weapon. Axinia knelt, feeling the earth's melody with her hands, every fiber of her being focused on the new hunt. The tiger's growls had ceased, but the roar of hunger in her own belly and in the bellies of her people was an even more menacing sound. The night was still long, but a new opportunity had revealed itself in the depths of the darkness. The tundra had given her a chance. Now she needed to seize it. With a determination bordering on obsession, Axinia crawled forward. The cold was an icy shroud tightening around her, but her mind burned with purpose. The vibrations of the woolly mammoth, slow and powerful, guided her like a beacon in the darkness. It wasn't a rhythm of hurried steps, but the heavy, methodical movement of a creature searching for sustenance, its tusks scraping the ice, its massive paws thudding against the frozen crust in search of hidden mosses and lichens. She approached with the caution of one hunting a spirit, not a beast of flesh and blood. Each scrape of her parka on the ice, each breath scratching her lungs, seemed too loud in the oppressive silence of the tundra. The vibrations on the ice surface were now so clear that Axinia could almost visualize the giant, its dark, shaggy mass stirring the snow around it. She felt the pattern of its steps, the distribution of its weight, the pauses as it sniffed. The elder stopped on a snow ridge, her body hunched with pain and exhaustion. She let her hands glide over the ice, reading the invisible cracks, feeling the reverberation of the subterranean river, now a constant thunder, even stronger beneath that area. There was a weakness there, a web of fine fissures, a convergence point of cold air currents beneath the surface that made the crust thinner and more fragile. The mammoth was slowly moving away from this spot, but Axinia knew it would return. Large animals tended to follow predetermined routes, and the fresh snow concealed the old trails. She needed something to lure it back. She looked at the ground, at the small clumps of moss and lichen that the wind hadn't entirely covered. With numb fingers, she gathered a handful, crushing it. The scent was faint, but perhaps enough for a hungry mammoth's keen sense of smell. It was an insane risk, a direct provocation of death, but death had been watching her for days. With the courage of the desperate, Axinia crawled to the weak point in the ice, not to hide, but to position herself. She scattered the moss on the snow, not in a pile, but in a subtle trail, guiding the mammoth to where the ice was most treacherous, to where the bellow of the subterranean river was most deafening. Each movement was torture, but the sight of her village's hungry children was a fire in her spirit. Then she waited. The wind howled, mocking her audacity. The cold bit deeper, but Axinia was immersed in her own sensations. The mammoth's tremor moved away, then slowly began to return. Stronger, clearer, closer. The giant's keen sense of smell had caught the trail. She felt the vibration of its heavy breathing, the way the ice groaned under the weight of its paws. The tension was almost unbearable. The mammoth approached the moss trail. Axinia felt the shift in vibrations, the slight deviation in its route. The ice beneath her began to sing, a chorus of fine cracks that quickly became deeper fissures. She could feel the undulation of the surface, the tremor coursing through the ground. The elder's heart pounded against her ribs, a drum of life amidst the tundra's anarchy. The mammoth, a prehistoric giant, sniffed the moss. Then it took a step, a heavy, decisive step, exactly onto the most fragile area. The bellow of the subterranean river transformed into a terrifying roar as the ice gave way. There wasn't an immediate collapse, but a slow, dreadful sinking. The mammoth bellowed, a sound of panic and pain, its legs struggling desperately for purchase. Axinia felt the earth tremble violently, a chaotic agitation that threatened to knock her down. Chunks of ice and snow were flung high, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and the animal's desperate lament. She clung to the ground, feeling the chaos, the struggle, the immense energy. The mammoth didn't fall into an abyss. It sank into a trap of ice and frozen mud, its legs ensnared, its massive body twisting in despair. Its bellows became muffled, a cry of rage and helplessness lost in the roar of the disintegrating ice. Axinia didn't wait. She knew that the mammoth's struggle to free itself would only trap it deeper in the deadly snare the tundra had provided. Nature was a relentless judge. Exhausted, but with a spark of triumph in her eyes, she rose. The ground still trembled with the giant's agony, but the immediate danger had passed. The cold still bit, but the bitter taste of her village's hunger for a brief moment had been replaced by a promise. She looked to the east, toward where her village waited, invisible in the vast darkness of the tundra. The night was still long, and the task of transporting the food would be monumental, perhaps impossible for a woman alone. But Axinia, the deaf elder who felt the world, had done her part. And more importantly, she had hunted. The wind's howl was a lament, the subterranean river's bellow, a funeral dirge for the fallen giant. But for Axinia, they were the sounds of life, the echo of hope. She began to drag herself homeward, her body broken, but her spirit indomitable. And she, with her wisdom and iron will, had seized it. The journey back would be the hardest, but she was no longer empty. The promise of food, the last hope of her people, pulsed in the earth's vibrations.